Hello, welcome to the Look Focus channel. Today we will tell you the incredible story of a woman who lost both her sight and hearing, but never lost her faith in life and her love for learning. Here is Helen Keller. Helen Keller was born on June 27, 1880, in the small town of Tuscumbia, Alabama, USA. Her father was a journalist in a small town and had served in the Confederate Army during the American Civil War. Helen was a healthy and charming baby. Before her illness, she had started walking and speaking a few words. However, at just 19 months old, she lost her abilities to see, hear, and speak due to a high fever that lasted several days. This illness suddenly severed her connection with the outside world. It was as if she had been confined to a dark prison cell from which she would never escape. This situation deeply affected her family, and they made every effort to seek treatment for her. Unfortunately, these efforts were to no avail. Helen was not a child who would easily give up in the face of difficulties. She began to explore and understand her surroundings by using her other senses. She would hold on to her mother's skirt and follow her wherever she went, trying to imitate what she did. She developed an irresistible curiosity about the outside world. She wanted to touch everything and smell everything. She tried to get to know everyone she met by examining their hands, faces, and clothes. Helen was a mischievous child in her early years. For example, once she locked her mother in the pantry. She also cut her friend's hair a few times. Generally, she managed to learn some things by imitating others' actions. For instance, she could milk a cow and knead dough. By utilizing the different smells of plants and soil in the garden, she could figure out where she was at any given moment. By the age of 7, she had developed more than 60 signs to communicate with her family. For example, she would make a cutting motion to ask for bread and shiver her arms as if she were cold to ask for ice cream. After the age of 5, Helen realized that she was different from other people. She noticed that her family communicated with their mouths instead of using signs like she did. Sometimes she tried to imitate their speech by touching their lips, but at first she couldn't produce any meaningful sounds. She very much wanted to speak like other people, but the frustration of not being able to achieve this made her distressed. This stress sometimes made her a temperamental child, leading to behaviors such as kicking, screaming, and biting. When she couldn't get what she wanted or couldn't express herself, she would have tantrums. As she grew older, these temper tantrums became more frequent. Helen needed a structured education, which her family was not equipped to provide. After conducting various research, her family encountered Dr. Anagnos, the director of the Perkins School for the Blind. A few years earlier, a deaf and blind girl named Laura Bridgman had received education at Perkins and achieved promising success. Dr. Anagnos believed that the dark and silent world of a blind and deaf child could be illuminated through education. Helen Keller's real life began on March 3, 1887, with the arrival of Anne Sullivan in Tuscumbia. Helen Keller remembers this day as the most important moment of her life. Anne Sullivan, a graduate of the Perkins School for the Blind and visually impaired herself, was assigned by the school director to educate Helen. Anne Sullivan became both a teacher and Helen Keller's closest and most trusted friend. Anne Sullivan believed that if Helen Keller received the necessary education, she could acquire many of the knowledge and skills that other people had. She first thought that Helen's temperamental behavior needed to be brought under control. She realized that these behaviors stem from Helen's inability to communicate with people. Anne was convinced that if Helen learned to communicate with others, she would become a different person. Anne Sullivan, using a firm yet gentle approach, quickly managed to control Helen's behaviors such as screaming, kicking, and biting. Helen's family was overly protective of her. Recognizing that this attitude was detrimental to Helen's education, Anne Sullivan eventually moved with Helen to a separate house. During her time at the Perkins Institute for the Blind, Anne Sullivan gained experience in the education of the deaf and blind. She learned sign language developed for the deaf. In the early stages of Helen Keller's education, she utilized this experience. She communicated by making various signs into Helen Keller's hand with her fingers. For example, to teach the word water, she held Helen's hand under the faucet, and to teach soil, she made Helen touch the soil. She spelled out each word letter by letter into Helen's hand. She repeated the process over and over until Helen learned the word. The first words Helen Keller learned were water and doll. Because the first word she could say was water, a fountain was built in her honor in the garden of Radcliffe College in June 1960. Anne Sullivan managed to teach Helen 30 words on the first day of her education. With the help of her teacher, Helen Sullivan, Helen tried to recognize all the objects around her by touching and smelling them. During this time, Helen suddenly discovered something very important for her. She realized that each letter drawn into her hand combined to form a word, and that everything in the world had a name. With the joy of this discovery, she started to touch and smell everything, asking what they were. Anne Sullivan tirelessly worked day and night to help Helen grow and understand the world. She constantly spoke to Helen about everything happening around her while simultaneously spelling out words and sentences into her hand, ensuring she memorized them. Through this method, Anne Sullivan enabled Helen to acquire as much knowledge as a hearing child. Anne Sullivan taught Helen Keller to read and write using Braille, and to understand what a person was saying by touching their lips with her fingertips to feel the vibrations. Very few people in her situation possess such a skill. Helen Keller also acquired the ability to speak, which is extremely difficult for someone without the sense of hearing to achieve. Helen Keller later moved to Boston with Anne to be closer to the school for the blind and deaf. There she attended Radcliffe College at Harvard University. In 1904, at the age of 24, she became the first deaf and blind person in history to successfully graduate from university. While in college, Helen Keller wrote a book titled The Story of My Life. This book was so well received and sold so well that Helen Keller was able to buy herself a house with the money she earned from it. The book was translated into 50 different languages. Additionally, she wrote 13 more books on topics such as blindness, deafness, social issues, and women's rights. Her writings and books were repeatedly published in various magazines and newspapers. To understand Helen Keller's worldview, I would like to present a few examples of her own words. When one door of happiness closes, another opens. But often we look so long at the closed door that we do not see the one which has been opened for us. A pessimist cannot discover the secrets of the stars, sail to an uncharted land, or open a new doorway for the human spirit. Although the world is full of suffering, it is also full of the overcoming of it. Some of the books written by Helen Keller are The World I Live In, Teacher Anne Sullivan, My Religion, My Later Life, The Song of the Stone Wall, Optimism. Remember, what you learn today shapes your tomorrow. If you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you in new videos. Goodbye.